Welcome to this module on starting your research journey. There are two parts to this module that first introduces you how to develop a research question and then guides you to thinking about collecting data to answer your research question. Before beginning this module, please make sure to have read SMIT Chapter 1 available in the module resources below. So let's begin with how to brainstorm and develop a solid research question for our respective research studies. Throughout this module, there will be some key research terms to add to our researcher lexicons. Be sure to take note of and review the meanings of these words as we proceed throughout the module. You may also access a glossary of these terms in the module resources below. A research question, or RQ, is a way for you to approach a particular topic from your own point of view. Good research questions often begin with a general topic that is narrowed down to a specific question. This question focuses your interest on exploring a particular pedagogical problem that exists, and through answering this question, you could potentially improve teaching and learning. Later, when you draft your research report, your research question will help you to develop the thesis statement around which your report revolves. So, what makes a good research question? A good research question is one that posits a pedagogical problem and is narrow and specific in its focus. A good research question is also relevant to a particular teaching context and to our field of TESOL. As such, it also specifies a population and variable or variables to be examined. A population is a group of individuals or objects known to have similar characteristics. In our field of TESOL, common populations are ESL or EFL teachers, students, administrators, or other people involved in the education of English learners. A variable is a characteristic or a person or object that varies depending on the population. Common variables in TESOL are attitudes, perceptions, language learning strategies, teaching methods, etc. Lastly, and perhaps most importantly, research questions are observable, measurable, and accessible, meaning that we can use certain research methods to collect data that helps to answer the research question and that we would see some sort of effect. So here is an example research question written in an observable, measurable, and accessible manner. You'll notice that the pedagogical problem and one variable to be studied is the guessing of the meaning of unknown words from context, and is a common issue in second language reading. You'll also see that this research study seeking to answer this research question is interested in the English for academic purposes student population and their respective second language reading fluency, which becomes the second variable in the study. What makes this research question effective is that you can already make some educated guesses about how this research study would proceed. How and in what ways gives us a clue that this is likely to be a qualitative study and that we would potentially interview or survey EAP students about how they use context to help them to deal with the meaning of unknown words when attempting to read more fluently. In order to begin thinking about forming your own potential research questions for your studies, let's dive into our focus topic for this course, researching issues in second language vocabulary. In 1972, a British linguist asserted that without grammar, very little can be conveyed, but without vocabulary, nothing can be conveyed, situating vocabulary as the heart of language and meaning. In the field of TESOL, teachers and researchers alike have debated the best ways to learn vocabulary in an additional language. Some, like Stephen Krashen, argue that ELs acquire vocabulary best through incidental techniques, techniques that involve repeated exposure of words in naturalistic and authentic contexts, therefore mirroring how we acquire vocabulary in our first languages. Others like Keith Fultz and Paul Nation argue that many ELs do not have the time and resources to simply pick up on words naturally, and thus they advocate for integrating intentional or explicit attention to vocabulary during the language teaching and learning process. The incidental versus intentional learning debate comprised two broad topics that govern the research issues of interest to vocabulary researchers in TESOL. So under the umbrellas of informing teachers and students on incidental versus intentional teaching and learning strategies, there are four typically broad questions in second language vocabulary studies that we focus on. So for example, we look at what are the different kinds of vocabulary in English or other languages? What are the actual components of knowing a word? What are the best ways to teach or learn a new word? And lastly, what strategies lead to receptive and productive vocabulary acquisition and retention? In sum, these four broad questions underscore the various research problems relating to the teaching and learning of second language vocabulary, whether that is through incidental or intentional learning techniques. We will revisit these four broad questions in relation to collecting vocabulary data a little later on in this module. It is important to connect our research questions to the two major research traditions in our field. Although both qualitative and quantitative research traditions adhere to the principles that define a good research question, they do use unique terms and discourse markers in the actual language of the research question that identify the study as qualitative or quantitative in nature. As such, let's review the characteristics of qualitative and quantitative research. Recall that qualitative research seeks to describe, observe, explore, identify, discover, and explain phenomena to generate theory, and often use softening verbs like suggest or imply to talk about findings in research reports. On the other hand, quantitative research aims to test and compare theory or hypotheses within different conditions. So they use terms like investigate the effect of, compare X in various conditions, to study X over time, or to measure the effect of X on Y. What follows are a series of research summaries from a Lawford study and from the 2016 vocab at Tokyo Research Conference. What I'd like you to do is read the summaries and see if you can determine if the study was a qualitative or quantitative study. You will be given a minute to read the summary before the answer appears automatically. Ready for the answer? Here, the keyword compared and differing conditions indicate that Fultz 2006 followed a quantitative research tradition and likely ran an experiment or a quasi-experiment to see what treatment condition affected the variable of vocabulary retention. Here's your second summary. All right, here's your answer. So Cohen in 1987 followed the qualitative tradition in his study, as characterized by the term observation and the presence of softening verbs like suggest and imply that acknowledge the subjective nature of qualitative research. Here's your next one. Okay, here's your answer. Here we see the key terms measure the effect of and probability followed up with numbers, thereby telling us that Swanborn and de Glopper's 2002 study was likely a quantitative study. All right. So the terms examine, explore, and describe signal a qualitative study. The word how also gives us a clue that the researcher was likely interested in generating theory and was not ready to test any particular theory just yet. We can thus translate these keywords and characteristics of the two research traditions into research questions. Remember, a good research question posits a pedagogical problem and specifies the population and variable or variables to be studied. Here we have some sample research question frames classified according to research tradition. Note these are samples and there are many other variations of research questions that you will likely come across as you delve into reading others' research studies. When you're looking over these frames, pay attention to the slots that indicate where a variable and a population would be identified. The variables and populations that fill the slots relate to the context of your research problem. Your variables should relate to various issues in the teaching and learning of second language vocabulary, and your populations should be focused and specific. That is, they should mention the characteristic that binds your population together, such as language proficiency level, students' grade level, age, their first language, etc. It is important not to use English learners or ESL students in general, because then your population is way too large and affects the scale of your research project. So let's get into developing your own research questions and the steps involved. First, decide on a topic that interests you. Think about your current or desired teaching context and either make a list of vocabulary problems you can think of or spend some time reviewing Schmidt's overview in this week's reading. The second step is to think about your population. Who are the participants you have access to or might be willing to participate in your study? If you want to avoid human participants, what are some other data sources you have access to, like textbooks, curriculum materials, learner language samples, etc.? Remember, human participant research requires the approval of Salem State's IRB committee, meaning you will have to write an IRB application and obtain IRB approval before being able to collect data. Now, this may sound like an intimidating process, but what you need to write the application is actually already contained in your research proposal. So if you're considering using human participants, view the IRB video in the module resources below. And if you're still unsure if your ideas would involve IRB approval, please let me know and I'm happy to help. Your next step is to read some other studies then that have focused on your topic. What did they do? Is there anything replicable? Look at their further research sections located in the discussion section of their articles. Here they often provide ideas or research questions that would improve their findings and contribute to further research. Your last step is then to begin drafting some research questions related to the research problem you wish to study. Your annotated bibliography will help you to refine your questions and decide what variables to investigate. Consider also consulting the list of research questions ideas that I compiled for you in Canvas. And also feel free to bounce ideas off of me by emailing me your ideas or stopping by office hours. So now that you have an idea about how to put together a solid research question, let's talk about data collection, a process that will affect how you answer your research question and something you should think about before you settle on your final research question. The first thing to consider when brainstorming how to collect data related to a research question is to ponder the construct validity of the data. Construct validity is the extent to which the data you collect can answer your research question. In other words, construct validity is making sure you are collecting data related to your research question. We really want to make sure we avoid collecting data that does not match our research goals, which would be an awful way to quickly invalidate our findings. We can also ensure construct validity by having clear and focused research questions and making sure that we choose the right data sources. So recall earlier that we talked about the research problems that second language vocabulary research is generally concerned with. To investigate these research problems, there are 4 main sources of vocabulary data. There is performance data, and this is data that involves results from tasks or tests that ask participants to produce something in relation to the question. Common performance data involves taking tests, producing spoken or written language, or classroom assignments, observations, etc. We can also collect samples of learner or teacher language, and this usually involves the transcription of natural oral language or the collection of naturally written texts like essays or teacher lesson plans that are not manipulated in any way by the researcher or any treatments. Such samples are usually used in qualitative research. We can also collect reports. These reports are usually data sources that derive from surveys, questionnaires, interviews, focus groups, or think alouds. Reports can be both qualitative and quantitative in nature. Lastly, we can also collect corpus data. Corpus data involves the large-scale collection of text, code for vocabulary-related variables, like the types of words, categories of words, phrases, etc. We typically see millions of texts compiled from sources like magazines, newspapers, online platforms, books, etc. to comprise corpus data. So to walk you through how to use construct validity to match your data sources with your research questions, let's go through each of the 4 broad vocabulary research problems we have reviewed here. So this question, what are the different kinds of vocabulary in English or other languages? There are various ways of exploring the different kinds of vocabulary of, say, a language, subject, or rhetorical style. This research problem or question aims to investigate what words are typically used in a population. Researchers interested in this problem want to know more about if a language is, for example, made up of single words or multi-word units or phrases. Or they might want to know about the differences in vocabulary between social and academic language. Or they might want to know if there's a specific lexicon for a particular academic subject or discipline. So in thinking about answering this research question, we could think about collecting samples of learner or teacher language and look for frequent patterns if we want to follow the qualitative tradition. Or we could do a quantitative study where we collect a corpus of text related to a particular population or subject and then run frequency analysis. Next we have, what are the components of knowing a word? The research problem relating to the components of knowing a word are often involving in the investigation of what it truly means to know a word. That is, for example, does the receptive lexicon match the productive lexicon? Or are there gaps in students' knowledge of a particular type of word? Or how does context affect learners' depth of polysemous word knowledge? So to research this vocabulary issue, you could again collect samples of learner language and code for errors in a qualitative study, or for a more quantitative study, you might collect performance data, such as having students take tests that measure different aspects of word knowledge and analyze the results for any gaps. The third research problem relates to what does it mean to teach or learn a new word, and what do learners or teachers do with a new word? Qualitative investigations of this issue often involve reports from interviews, think-alouds, or focus groups with learners or teachers to gather their opinions and/or strategies on how they approach a new word. You could also do observations of how teachers introduce a new vocabulary word within a lesson. Quantitative research would still involve reports, but from a survey or questionnaire approach. To answer this question, performance data is usually the best route to go. Qualitatively, this means doing many observations over time of what strategies teachers use to highlight and review vocabulary. Quantitatively, the typical way to investigate best practices requires some sort of experiment or quasi-experiment that involves the pre-testing, the implementation of interventions, and some sort of post-testing or delayed post-testing. Research instruments are necessary to collect data. A research instrument is a tool designed to give you data. Instruments can be checklists, interview questions, tests, computer programs, etc. You can design your own instruments, as is often the case with surveys, questionnaires, interviews, or certain tests, or you can use readily available instruments that have already been designed and utilized by experts in the field. Existing instruments are popular with quantitative researchers because they've already been battle tested in the field and in previous research studies. Here is a list of some already available instruments that are largely used in those quantitative studies. If you have any questions about these instruments, spend some time online researching them, or you can see me for help. Here is a list of some notable vocabulary experts in the field. As you begin to explore the literature related to your research questions, you may see these names pop up. If you do, be sure to visit how they framed their research questions and their data collection methods. You could even possibly do a replication study if you like their study. So it is now time to brainstorm some research questions. This will help you dive into the Salem State Library databases and begin searching for articles and resources to use for your annotated bibliography and later your literature review. Once you have some research questions brainstormed, your next steps are to view the IRB video if you are considering using human participants. If not, move on to McKay Chapter 4 and view Module 2, which walks you through how to use precedent research in your study and form your annotated bibliography. Lastly, find articles to support your research question and complete your annotated bibliography assignment. Good luck!